This is a follow-up and second event to promote planning matters. This publication is the result of collaboration and partnership between the National Records of Scotland, Creative Carbon Scotland and Scottish Council on Archives. We're very pleased to welcome our partners, Creative Carbon Scotland, who will be helping us to consider building resilience beyond COVID-19, how planning can minimise risk and adapt the archive sector to the impacts of climate change and COVID-19. Big topic. I'd like to give a little background and context and introduce what is happening today as we have a tight programme. The Preservation Committee of Scottish Council on Archives aims to take a strategic approach, identifying priority areas for action relating to the preservation and conservation of Scotland's archive collection and associated access issues. Why planning matters. There is no shortage of incident control and disaster planning texts, but a survey of our members to inform our business plan identified this as a particular need, and this was further supported by feedback from the National Accreditation Framework Standard Spectrum 5.0. It is essentially a roadmap to developing your plan and can be adapted to suit your organisational needs and circumstances. Basically, if you complete the editable templates, you will have the bare bones of a plan. That's the main idea. We consulted widely across the sector and have referenced the standards and provided exemplars, and this will remain an ongoing process. We aim to update and adapt the plan, and to do this we need and welcome your ongoing feedback. You will see with help from our partners that we have integrated new text and links in this version. During the preparation of planning matters, the COVID-19 pandemic emerged across the world at frightening speed and with dramatic consequences for how we live our daily lives and how we work, often now from home or at home trying to work. In Scotland and the UK, it is important to listen to and understand and implement the guidance given by the government. The key principles and elements remain, however, COVID-19 has impacted the circumstances in which services respond to incidents. We recognise the need to augment the guidance based on the lessons learned. Hindsight remains a wonderful thing, if only. It does not cover every eventuality. This current situation is unprecedented, but we are learning and adapting. It is important that in these difficult circumstances, we continue to make the best choices we can for the care of our collections, and that these remain based on sound professional standards, but also take account of long-term sustainability. These are not mutually exclusive choices. New initiatives and positive movements are emerging. For instance, in Scotland, Heritage Declares is a non-affiliated group of conservation professionals and organisations seeking to raise awareness of the climate emergency within the heritage sector. Launched in autumn 2019, its 10-point declaration invites people to commit to new ways of working with our shared built heritage to reduce environmental impact and encourage sustainability. Maintenance, repair and reuse of existing buildings. Many of us have sites that are adapted. The campaign addresses how climate affects heritage and how heritage, old buildings themselves, and the decisions, interventions, techniques, materials and technologies we apply to them can be part of the creative solution. Also in November, IIC, the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, held its Congress virtually in Edinburgh, and the theme explored was current practices and challenges in built heritage conservation. This is all very positive. Today, the focus is on archives rather than organisational records, with the emphasis on practicalities of risk management, including planning. The guidance draws on and supports existing standards, but also aims to take into account recent national and international initiatives. It is designed to aid those who care for archives wherever they are held. Archive services, special collections within libraries and those housed in private historic houses. It focuses on key factors to consider when preparing an emergency plan. And there are key templates on risk assessment and management, emergency plan, training, business continuity and long-term recovery. There are also 2 quick reference documents, emergency plan salvage and recovery crib sheet. The guidance aims to include all the basic elements, but it also contains additional detailed guidance on staff welfare, never more important than it is now, dealing with sensitive information, very particularly important for archives, testing plans, training, social media and collaboration with support networks. Can I urge you to all stay with us for the exercise which follows after the speakers? And also, can I ask you to mute your microphones as we go to our first speaker, who is Ellie Murtagh, Climate Resilience Project Coordinator, Adaptation Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks, bear with me. I'll just share my screen momentarily. Apologies. So I don't know if a member of the tech team could support me. It's not letting me share my PowerPoint for some reason, although it did in the test run. You
want to try again?
Yeah, okay. Can you see it now? Okay,
Yes,
fantastic. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Apologies for the slight delay. And yeah, hello everyone. My name is Ellie Murta and I'm a climate resilience coordinator at Adaptation Scotland. And we were really delighted to be asked here today to present on what is adaptation, how will climate change affect Scotland and what we can do about it. So firstly, a brief introduction to Adaptation Scotland for those who don't yet know us. We are a Scottish Government funded programme that is delivered by the sustainability charity Sniffer, and we provide advice and support to communities, public bodies and businesses to prepare for and build resilience to the impacts of climate change. So today I'll provide a brief introduction into what adaptation is, what climate change means for Scotland, and then briefly give a few examples of adaptation in practice. So firstly, what is adaptation? Well, the Scottish Government in the first Climate Change Adaptation Programme defines it as the adjustment in economic, social or natural systems in response to actual or expected climatic change to both limit harmful consequences and exploit beneficial opportunities. So what this means is that adaptation is all about understanding how our climate is changing and working to prepare for those changes by minimising risk, by building resilience, and where possible, taking advantage of any opportunities that may arise. But what I wanted to quickly touch upon was how this differs from mitigation. So mitigation is all about reducing our greenhouse gases in order to stop climate change. So mitigation activities are often called low carbon actions, include things like flying or driving less, changing to a plant-based diet, going away from fossil fuels to more renewable energy sources. And these are obviously really, really key activities, but they need to be done in tandem with adaptation, which is all about recognizing that climate change isn't some far off distant future that we can limit. We're already experiencing it, and we need to start adjusting to the impacts of climate change to reduce those negative impacts and take advantage of any opportunities. And examples range from sustainable urban drainage systems, working to repair sand dunes on our coasts, or building community resilience action plans and groups. Now, adaptation, as the definition implies, is all about adjusting and preparing to both our current climate as well as our future climate. So I just want to explore what both of those may mean for Scotland now. Firstly, looking at, well, how has our climate changed so far? And this graphic really starkly illustrates this. This is what we call the warming stripes or climate stripes image. And it takes the annual average temperature for here in Scotland. And if that average temperature is colder than average, it's blue. If it's warmer than average, it's red. And the gradient of that color differs on the extent to which it is higher or lower than the average. And as you can see here, the trend is obviously warming towards red, but also the depth of the red at the far right of this image is quite striking in that many of the warmest years on record have occurred within the past few decades. And we can see this when we start to explore and interrogate meteorological historical data. And because Scotland, like countries around the world, has already experienced the impacts of climate change. If we look at annual temperature, Scotland has warmed by 1 degree Celsius since 1900, as you can see in the graph on the left. In terms of precipitation, that's been increasing since roughly 1960. And there's a general trend, but also we're experiencing increased frequency of extreme precipitation events that can often lead to flooding. And that's illustrated on the right. So to reflect and summarise, Scotland's 10 warmest years on record have all been in the past 2 decades. We've had a significant infall in rainfall, particularly over winter, and the UK has already experienced sea level rise around our coasts. And we expect for these trends to continue into the future. If we look at the UKCP Met Office data, so that's provided by our meteorological agency, we can see that in relation to rainfall, we will get much wetter winters with much more intense rainfall events, which means increased chances of flooding. So if you can recall the winter that we had in 2015, 2016, where there was a lot of widespread flooding, particularly in the northeast, we can anticipate this is going to occur much more regularly and is something we need to prepare for. Likewise, we're going to get drier and warmer summers, much like the summer that we experienced in 2018, because by the year 2050, there's a likelihood that that type of extreme heat event could occur every other summer. So again, something we need to be preparing for. Now, if we continue to look at climate projections much for the longer term, and this example takes what we call a high-end emissions scenario, or RCP 8.5, we can see that if we continue on this trajectory or path that we're on now, we could likely see up to 4 degrees of warming by 2100. And this is obviously really, really pivotal because climate policy goals are premised on the fact that we need to maintain below 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at the very maximum 2 degrees, because this is a key threshold. And if we go beyond this, we can see lots of significant tipping points and environmental feedback loops. So that's why there's a very key policy agenda and ambition to maintain within that 2 degree limit. And I realize that this often in common parlance doesn't sound like a lot. You know, if it's 1 degree warmer, it's 2 degree warmer. Why does that matter? Well, an example to explore what this means in practice is by looking at what we call climate analogues, or looking at an example of a country that already has that type of climate. And we can do this for Scotland. So for instance, London was about 3 degrees warmer than Edinburgh, and that's the climate that we could experience by the 2050s on this emissions pathway. But if we look to the 2080s and we're getting about 4 degrees of warming, that's potentially much more like those that are currently experienced in Southern Europe. So think south of Spain, south of France. And whilst that might sound lovely, there's obviously widespread implications of our changing climate across our society, economy, and natural and built environment. So just to recap on terms of our long-term trends for Scotland in relation to climate change, our weather will remain variable. Our summers will be hotter and drier. Our winters and autumns will be milder and wetter. Our coasts can experience sea level rise, and we'll get a lot more increased frequency of extreme events such as heat waves, droughts, and flooding, but also reduced occurrence of frost and snowfall. So that's just a very quick start of 10 about climate change trends projections. And now I want to discuss, well, what does it actually mean in practice for Scotland? Well, Adaptation Scotland has identified 15 key consequences of climate change, and you can find a lot more detail on our website there, but I've just highlighted a few that I thought were particularly pertinent for the archive sector and the discussions we're about to have today. And these range from things such as the increased risk of flooding, which has consequences on the performance of both our buildings and our businesses, our cultural heritage, and importantly also our national identity. Another key one is the fact that our infrastructure is very interdependent and connected. So we need to be looking and preparing for potentially cascading impacts. And lastly, but arguably most important, is the health and well-being of our people, which impacts every sector, but again in the archives world could influence not only the ability of your staff to be able to come to work, but also your users and your wider audiences. Now, these are called consequences of climate change rather than just challenges, because whilst they are significant impacts, they also pose potential opportunities to make plans and build things that are better, more resilient, and lead to more advantageous outcomes for our society. And I just wanted to quickly touch upon the wider benefits of adaptation. And this is a figure that kind of illustrates this, in that adaptation isn't just about the immediate avoided losses. So, you know, you didn't have a flood, but it's also about the greater economic benefits. Because you avoided those losses, you might have had increased staff productivity, you had economic incentives, you maybe led to new innovations or new business practices. And that can also lead to wider social and environmental benefits. So for example, if we take a nature-based solution to minimize our risk of flooding, that can also improve the water and air quality, which means that maybe more people use it as amenity and improve the physical and mental health of the people who access it. So adaptation isn't just about responding to those immediate climate risks, it's about preparing for our climate in a way that's advantageous and beneficial to the wider society and our needs. And this is really what Adaptation Scotland advocates for. And I just want to briefly touch upon a few of these projects now. We do a lot of work with what we call ClimateReady Places, and that ranges from activity at the locality, city and regional level, such as Edinburgh Adapts, Aberdeen Adapts, or Highland Adapts. And these are all partnership initiatives where the public body or the local authorities are working with public, private and third sector organisations, as well as community members, to understand what climate change means for the region.
1 minute.
1 minute, and I would advocate for any organisation who's located in these areas to reach out to them if you'd like to participate. And this is just an example of them there. Also to flag, Adaptation Scotland supports public bodies to adapt through an adaptation capability framework that advises on how organisations can develop and work with the organisational culture to plan and implement adaptation and collaborate. And within that framework, we have a number of climate change risk assessment guidance and support, both at the strategic and project level. So I think this is very complementary and is actually flagged in the planning guidance document. But if you are interested, please download them, access our website. But also if you need any support in using them, feel free to email us and we'd be happy to support. And just to conclude, whilst climate change is a challenge, it's also obviously a huge opportunity to improve the life and well-being, but also to protect our cultural heritage and our archives for both current and future generations. And I'm very excited to see the organisations here today working to do that. And please let us know if there's anything we can do to support you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellie. Right on time. And I'd now like to turn to Katrina Patterson, Transformation of Culture Programme Lead, and Amanda Grimm, Transformation of Culture Officer for Creative Carbon Scotland, our partners here today, to give their presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda, and thank you very much to Ellie for that amazing presentation. It's made my job a lot easier. So yeah, just a bit of a short introduction about Creative Carbon Scotland. We are a Scottish charity that works with the wider cultural sector to tackle climate change. Honestly, working with archives and archivists is relatively new to us, so we were really pleased when the Scottish Council on Archives reached out about their emergency planning guidance and kind of asked us to contribute to that. There's loads of learning, I think, going kind of both ways. So obviously today is thinking about emergency planning and that specifically in relation to climate change. But at Creative Carbon Scotland, it's 100% climate emergency 100% of the time. I want to say a little bit about why we've started to grow our work on climate change adaptation, and then my colleague Amanda is going to give us a few examples from kind of wider cultural sector about how that's already been taken on. So yes, as Ellie very eloquently explained, there is mitigation and adaptation, and for years Creative Carbon Scotland really just focused on the mitigating the elements of climate change, so reducing emissions, thinking about environmental impact of work. But as we kind of have discussed, there are some climate impacts, consequences, which are now inevitable. And so we think this is really important for culture, as the cultural sector, and by that I mean kind of everything from performing visual arts to literature to archives, and also to kind of where the intersection of culture and heritage comes in. Culture is historically more vulnerable because we exist on particularly types of funding, grants and different funding bodies, because of the communities that we work with, and because often of the buildings and the spaces in which we operate. However, I would counter that to say that we're also historically much more adaptable, as demonstrated by COVID-19 in the last few months, but also in kind of the creativity and adaptability that it's really how the kind of culture sector thrives. So nationally and regionally, there's some really exciting work happening on adaptation, and do take a look at the different projects that Ellie highlighted and what might be happening within your local authority or within your organisation if you're coming from a local authority yourself. but we've found it's historically quite rare for specific and individual cultural organisations, or for that nature archives, to be thinking about how climate change will affect them. As Creative Carbon Scotland, we're trying to kind of help overcome some of those things in a number of different ways. Firstly, by conducting research. Last year, we undertook a piece of research into how the visual arts sector can adapt to climate change. And that was specifically also looking at kind of the creation of visual art, but also museums and galleries and the hosting conditions of art and how that will be affected through the changing climate, but also undertaking particular action research. So for example, one of my projects at the moment is working with an EU and Scottish government funded project in Scotland, Ireland, Sweden and Belgium to explore how cultural organisations in Northwest Europe can kind of change their buildings, what they do, how they work. We're also exploring how cultural materials and practices can go the other way and influence adaptation. So there's a lot of kind of creativity, a lot of like really good ways of working already in culture and archives, and we want to try and inject a bit of that into adaptation planning. And finally, we also love to participate in the conversations like these and kind of host workshops to kind of get the conversation a bit more started. So that's very short from me, but I'll pass on to Amanda now, who's going to talk through some examples.
Hi, thank you, Katrina. So yes, I'm Amanda Grimm and I'm the Transformation of Culture Officer at Creative Carbon Scotland. I'm going to share my screen as I have just a few slides. All right. So yes, I mainly support the Green Arts Initiative, which is a membership organisation of around 290 arts and cultural organisations across Scotland who are all working to reduce their environmental impact and bring about a more sustainable country. And this is the Green Arts Initiative logo here. So knowledge and focus on climate adaptation is growing within the initiative, which is driven partly by us at Creative Carbon Scotland, partly by local councils and the Scottish Government who are highlighting the need to adapt to climate change, and partly by the members themselves, especially those who have already seen the effects of climate-induced events on their programs and organisations. For example, the Milla Festival on Leith Links had to be cancelled a few years ago because of high winds, and during the Beast from the East, the Glasgow Women's Library had to shut for a week and cancel or postpone many of its events. So I'm going to briefly talk about a few Green Arts member organisations who have been working on climate adaptation to provide some ideas and examples of good practice in the arts sector, much of which is also applicable to the archives and records sector. So the first is Edinburgh Art Festival, which is one of the 11 major festivals in Edinburgh, which takes place outside of a pandemic every August alongside the Fringe and the International Festival. They've recently written a climate risk management plan, and their opening statement includes phrases which are very pertinent to the event today. So it says, building resilience to the current and expected impacts of climate change through adaptation is crucial to cope with threats and to find innovative ways to exploit opportunities, as Ellie mentioned. In doing so, business continuity and profitability will be better protected, and Edinburgh Art Festival will be more resilient to change. They've already been affected by heavy rainfall, so that's one of the threats they've identified, because it's caused them to have to cancel an event linked to one of their exhibitions, Mud Oven, a couple of years ago. They've also been affected by snow and ice, which prevented staff from getting to work, which also disrupted their program delivery, in turn having a knock-on effect on their finances as it cost them money. But as well as identifying threats, their plan also looks at opportunities from upcoming changes due to climate change. For example, they recognize that concern over changeable weather and increasing concern about the carbon footprint of air travel is likely to lead to reduced long distance travel and therefore to a smaller international or non-local audience for their festival. But by identifying this projected trend now, they can start to engage more local audiences through tailored marketing and community engagement programs, so they will be better positioned to retain a high share of the local audience as visitors from further afield gradually decrease and as competition for local audiences increases among the 5 August festivals. I'm going to skip the next one as we're a little bit short on time, and I'm going to move on to talking about the Glasgow Women's Library, which will be the most relevant to the archives sector. Glasgow Women's Library is a member of the Green Arts Initiative, and they've been engaging with our guidance and workshops on adaptation for a couple of years now. So a group of students from the University of Edinburgh carried out a study on how the Glasgow Women's Library could adapt to climate change. They applied the BACLIAT vulnerability assessment, which was developed by Oxford University and businesses and stands for Business Areas Climate Impact Tool. The BACLIAT assessment categorizes recommendations into 4 adaptation strategy areas: temporary, strategic, managerial, and technical. For each identified threat, the students looked at how the Glasgow Women's Library could minimize the threat by making changes in these 4 areas. So for example, they identified one threat, which was increased flooding, which could do damage to the building structure, including the drainage system and the library content. Their suggested measures, adaptation measures for this threat included, in the temporary category, having emergency provision of sandbags to hand. In the strategic category, they recommended moving content from the flood risk zone to higher ground, establishing a minimum height of bookshelves for particularly valuable items, and incorporating emergency planning and a temporary relocation spot for library content in the case of a severe flood. In the managerial area, they recommended establishing a training scheme for staff on the procedure to take in case of flooding. And on the technical side, they suggested procuring removable flood barriers and installing a sustainable drainage system to reduce the potential of excess drainage water. Interestingly, the report also identified that cold, rainy, stormy weather is likely to result in a decreased visitor count, which could then result in the cultural importance and relevance of the library being diminished. This is something for all public-facing organizations to consider. One way you could adapt to this is, of course, by moving content online, but other ways you could try to adapt are by making your space into a nice shelter. Okay, thanks. From making your space into a nice shelter from the bad weather, a nice warm place to go and spend a rainy day. One way you could do that is by providing a warm cloakroom for visitors to dry off and store wet clothing when they arrive. Hopefully that would be heated by renewable energy to avoid contributing to further climate change. You could also offer visitors rain ponchos and umbrellas for sale. And if those were branded, they could help maintain your reputation around the city. And in Glasgow Women's Library's case, you could provide waterproof bags for transporting books, which could be returned in exchange for your deposit back. So very quickly, Creative Carbon Scotland and the Cultural Adaptations Project will continue to support the cultural sector to explore creative ways to adapt and build resilience to climate change, as well as to this new COVID era of home working and digital cultural delivery. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina and Amanda. And we go to our next speaker, Melinda Haunton, Programme Manager, Archive Accreditation, the National Archives in Kew. Thank you for joining us again this time, Melinda.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry for not showing you my face. I'm on a bit of a lash up setup here. Oh Lord. And as you can see, things are not absolutely ideal in my slideshow setup. But I'm still really, really glad to be able to come here and reflect a little bit about what's really been a roller coaster year in terms of understanding what business continuity planning is really about in practice. You know, we have all been through some fairly radical times in the last few months. You know, we have been shocked. We've had to re-engineer and adapt on the hoof. We've had to realize that dealing with the major challenge isn't always just about the practicalities, it's about the emotions and the complexity that raises within your staff and within your team. And it was really good to see staff wellbeing mentioned as one of the issues around climate change too, because I think we've all learnt that the people factor is a massive one. So what the National Archives has been doing is essentially gathering intelligence, bringing people together, and then sharing that back out with guidance where we can. So in the early days, which is roughly where we were when Planning Matters was launched, we were surveying. We were getting a sense from the archive sector of where you were and the kind of challenges that you were immediately facing and what had worked well in that initial shocking period in March when we all had to shut our doors. But we then moved on into the kind of the summer when things calmed down a little bit more. We started to think positively. We started to think about what a reopened approach would look like. And we started to think about capturing some of those lessons for the long term. So, for example, we put out a checklist around making plans for reopening. I will share these slides with all the attendees, so don't worry about making notes on these, but there are some quite useful links here I think you can use. So thinking about in reopening, what reopening looks like and how it might be phased and what the risks might be. We also talked about how COVID in this case, but any emergency affects people differently, and so held a webinar and put out some guidance around reopening inclusively, so that it's not just the lowest common denominator that gets served. We're recognising differences in need, and because, as I say, all of your business continuity plans have had the most tremendous workout in the last few months, and we've really been thinking about how what worked and what didn't. We've published feedback from a more detailed survey about business continuity planning, just to think about what worked well. Essentially, it was about being resilient and being adaptive and having systems that that supported that tended to be the good things that came through the feedback. So now it's the autumn. We've been round in a sort of loop, and I think for the purposes of this webinar, the thing that's really important to take away is that business continuity planning isn't just one moment, it's not one thing. You don't do it and then it's fixed and done and you don't need to think about it anymore. It just keeps on coming, because we had to start making guidance about reclosure for the archive services that had opened. We weren't actually allowed to call it reclosure, it's called making short-term changes to services, but internally we call that the reclosure guidance, because essentially that's what it is. And so it's that iterative process of what worked well the first time, let's learn some lessons and let's feed that back into what might help in the future. We were hoping that the future would be a little bit further off than sort of 3 months down the line from when services reopened, but nonetheless, it has been a very brisk lesson in in how fast business continuity planning can need to be reviewed. And we hope that services that learned some lessons for what their plans should have been doing in March had actually had time to reflect that in their plans by the time in October, November, it turned out we needed them all over again. We're also, of course, having a look at more information gathering, because this has been a roller coaster of a year, as I started out saying. We are currently surveying again to look at impact, because the impact that we sort of captured in an initial survey in May is obviously now rather different now that we've settled into a rather longer slog. And we will again publish the findings from that so that you can just get a sense of how other archives are being affected. And the other thing to say with my accreditation hat on is that we will of course be capturing some of this for the medium and longer term in the archive service accreditation guidance. We only update that once a year so that we're not currently constantly asking you to check your versions, but there will be a reflection on what good business continuity practice looks like based on the very stringent lessons of this year. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you. And unfortunately, our next speaker, my colleague Jane Brown, Head of Archive Liaison and Strategy, National Records of Scotland, is not well this morning. So we're going to move straight to Mary Davis, Climate Change Manager, Historic Environment Scotland. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks very much. I'll just share. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about our adaptation journey at Historic Environment Scotland, because I think that a lot of our experience will be relevant to all of you in your archives roles. Historic Environment Scotland's adaptation journey really started about 10 years ago when we were still Historic Scotland, and following the passing of the Climate Change Scotland Act, it was clear that there were responsibilities being put on us as a public body around mitigation, adaptation and sustainability. So in 2012 we published our first Climate Change Action Plan, and within that we actually had a whole section on building resilience, which really reflected what now is commonly known as adaptation, so preparing the historic environment for climate change. And we committed to assessing climate change risk across the estate that we look after of over 300 properties in care, historic properties from Edinburgh Castle to the standing stones at Callanish and everything in between, but also providing advice and guidance to the broader heritage sector on climate change impacts and adaptation. So there's a huge range of potential impacts on the historic environment of climate change, from waterlogging and erosion, coastal erosion, flooding, wildfires, and lots of others as well. One of the first things that we did was undertake a climate change risk assessment of the Historic Environment Scotland properties in care. So, as I say, we have hundreds of properties, they're all different, and what we rapidly realised was that we really didn't have a good understanding of environmental risk in those properties. There was no systematic baseline reporting of environmental hazards or risk. So we worked in partnership with SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and British Geological Survey, BGS, to look at the baseline natural hazard risk from various data sets where we knew we had good quality spatial data. So we looked at coastal erosion, ground instability, and various kinds of flooding. Now, this is really current environmental hazard risk, but as climate change intensifies, the occurrence rates of all these natural hazards are going to increase. Everything is going to get worse, basically. Flooding is going to get worse as a result of climate change. Coastal erosion is going to get worse as a result of sea level rise and other factors. And I don't unfortunately have time to go through the detail of this, but the main finding was that of the sites investigated, the majority were at high or very high risk against one or more of those natural hazards. And even when we accounted for the various control factors that were already in place, like the sites where we had a staffed presence and reaction times could be quicker, we still found that the majority of our sites were at high or very high risk. So this was obviously something that we needed to deal with on a site-by-site basis. Now, the initial results of this report were actually fed into a progress report on the conservation and management of the properties in care that was presented to the Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, back in 2017. And as a result of that report, additional funding was granted by the Cabinet Secretary to Historic Environment Scotland for the conservation of the estate, and she specifically cited climate change as a reason for that cash injection. So there was a very clear relationship between the assessment that we did and obtaining additional funding. Now, the results of that report were also fed into the asset management plan for the estate that was published in 2018. So really the idea was to mainstream adapting to climate change in everything that we do around asset management. I'll give you a wee example. I hope this one will be particularly relevant to you. This is Duff House in Banff in Aberdeenshire, which some of you may be familiar with. It's an early Georgian mansion that has a long and illustrious history. Very famous architect, obviously, and has been used for various purposes, from a family home to, as it is now, a visitor attraction. And it also houses an art collection from National Galleries Scotland. It has a wonderful collection of art that is very valuable. Now, when we looked at the impacts, the potential impacts of climate change, what we found was that Duff House was already quite vulnerable to fluvial flooding risk. It's quite close to a river, and there was historic precedent for flooding around the house. Now, the current flood risk indicated that there were certain circumstances where the house itself could potentially flood. And when we looked online to see if anybody had taken photographs of flooding in the recent past, we did discover that there had been flooding really quite recently, within the last 10 or 20 years, that had come quite scarily close to the house itself. So obviously that was something that we needed to deal with in terms of our management of that site. Now our collections team were developing a salvage plan for the site. Traditionally, obviously that looks a lot at fire risk, but it was quite clear that we needed to incorporate that as well. So we worked with our colleagues in collections team on a new salvage plan for Duff House. The mapping helps us determine particular access problems that might be the case in an emergency as well. So not just the direct impact on the house, but how the infrastructure around about might be affected as well. And it also let us understand where safe areas might be, where artefacts, paintings and so on could be stored in the event of an emergency. We helped the collections team deliver salvage training to HES staff and various partners, which included the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, our colleagues at National Galleries Scotland and our salvage contractor. So we were able to raise awareness of climate change and the related hazards. And as a result of that, we actually had contact from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service asking for our slides. So there was a great opportunity there to raise awareness around impacts and adaptation. Now, since then, we have worked under the Our Place in Time, Scotland's Historic Environment Strategy. We worked with partners on climate change, and we formed a group to represent all the different parts of the sector. And what was very clear was that what people really needed was an assessment of what climate change impacts might mean for Scotland and for the various types of asset that we look after. So we worked with partners across the historic environment sector to produce a guide to climate change impacts on Scotland's historic environment. Now, we divided the historic environment up into different types of assets, but I think what you'll probably find is that several of these might actually be relevant to you and your work. So we looked at roof buildings and infrastructure, which people have already talked about this morning and are obviously very relevant. Gardens and designed landscapes, marine, coastal, surface remains, buried remains, and collections and internal fabric. And I think that within that collections theme, you could also include the kind of archive material that you're perhaps working with. So the aim was, as I say, to identify the climate change impacts and the possible adaptation measures that could be applied by the caretakers and owners of those historic assets. So I'll give you an example. These tables are quite detailed, and hopefully they're all the more useful for that. I'm not going to expect you to read all of this right now, really just to highlight that it lists for each type of asset, the potential impacts, the hazards, the exposure, the vulnerability or sensitivity of that particular asset to those impacts and hazards, and then list some potential, a non-exhaustive list of adaptive measures. Now, these have been divided into resistance and acceptance. So slightly different approaches to adaptation, whether you attempt to just stop what's happening, for instance, by putting a seawall in at a vulnerable site on the coast, to accepting what's going to happen and working with the hazard. So that can potentially lead to things like nature-based solutions. In the coastal example, that could look at working with the existing wetlands to manage the risk from coastal flooding, for instance. So here's an example. We have a double page spread for each of these asset types. This is the one for collections and internal fabric, and it kind of flags up some of the main impacts. So for collections and internal fabric, here is flagged higher internal humidity as a result of warmer temperatures and increased rainfall rates. So something that has already been touched on in the case of Glasgow Women's Library. Higher internal temperatures causing drying out or thermal stress on internal fabric and objects. Increased fire risk, causing physical damage and loss, increased rainfall, causing more frequent and prolonged saturation of building fabric, and enhanced rates of building fabric decay. Fluctuating internal humidity levels, which is obviously going to be a big one for anyone dealing with archives, and increased occurrence rates or severity of flooding, which were obviously relevant in the case of Duff House and may well be relevant to the building that you're working in. So this is a really useful resource. It's a starting point, and hopefully it will start lots of conversations around these impacts and how we adapt to them. But we're always interested in getting feedback from stakeholders and partners on this guide and how it could perhaps be revised in future. We have just very recently, it was actually just before things got very strange earlier on this year, back in February, we launched our Climate Action Plan. So this takes us from 2020 to 2025, and it lists all the things that we're intending to do around a variety of themes, one of which is climate impacts and adaptation. So a lot of the work that we're doing under this theme is continuation of work that we've done over the last 10 years or so. But we're kind of now moving to a higher level of maturity as an organisation around impacts and adaptation, and working beyond looking just at the physical impacts on the historic properties and care that we look after, and looking at mainstreaming climate change risk and adaptation into everything that we do, into policy and all our operations. We're really hoping to be an exemplar of best practice, and we are already recognised internationally as a leader in this field. We are also looking to promote maintenance repair as the first line of defence, and we have a huge range of publications that can help you with that. Focus particularly on traditional buildings, which many of you will be operating out of. And looking at the wider historic environment as well, and ensuring that the historic environment is climate ready, and that is starting to filter into the grant schemes that we operate. So we're also hoping to provide leadership on the management of loss of heritage assets, and having those difficult conversations around some of the inevitable consequences. So it's an ongoing conversation in the historic environment, what we can actually let go and what we hold on to for dear life. We can't save everything.
Thank you.
So hopefully that gives you a useful overview. There's my contact details there. I'm very happy to have further conversations with people around what I've just said. You can find all of the publications that I've alluded to on the Historic Environment Scotland website, so please do go and have a look around.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I think it's now over to Katrina and Amanda to chair this second part and introduce the exercises. And please stay with us if you can.
That's right. Thanks, Linda. And thank you very much to all the speakers. It's really good to see the crossover between our work in different sectors on adapting to climate change and other challenges. So we're now going to have an interactive session to get everybody thinking. So we'll move into breakout rooms, and we're going to be looking at how to create a plan to respond to or prevent a climate change induced emergency. So I'll just explain how the exercise will work first. So we'll be split into breakout rooms in groups of up to 10 people each. We'll have a set of scenarios in which your group works for a certain type of organization and is impacted by a certain type of climate event, such as a flood, a landslip, a storm which causes damage to communication infrastructure, and other scenarios. Just before we go into the rooms, I'll share with you a link to a Google Doc which has all these scenarios written out and all the instructions for the exercise. And I'll be sharing that in the chat box. So if you're not very familiar with Zoom, if you just want to check that, you can access the chat now. So on the menu at the bottom, you should see a little speech bubble with chat, or if your screen's too small, you might see 3 dots with and the word more. And if you click on that, you can click on chat. So hopefully that works for everybody. So yeah, once you're in the breakout rooms, please first choose one scenario to discuss from the document. Then please work together to do the following. And I'll paste these key tasks into the chat bar now, but they're also in the document, which I will share. So the tasks are: 1, identify the risks to your building and organization. 2, identify what you need to protect or what problems you will need to overcome. 3, identify measures you can take now to reduce this sort of risk in the future. And for each identified risk, you might want to write out the action to be carried out, the priority for each action, whether it's high, medium, or low priority, and which department or role is responsible. But don't worry if you don't have time to get into that level of detail. And if you also have extra time at the end, you can share your own experiences of extreme weather events or other climate-induced emergencies and how your organization responded or should have responded. All right, when you're considering what you need to protect or the problems you'll need to overcome, it can help to think in terms of these categories, which I'll paste into the chat now, but these are also written on the Google Doc. So the categories are physical, financial, reputational, logistical or procedural, employees or HR, and actions to take now versus actions to take in the actual event of an emergency. Right, so when you get into your rooms, after you all introduce yourselves and choose a scenario, please appoint one person to take notes, ideally on your computer, so then you can paste your notes into the chat bar when we come back to the main room and we'll all feed back. And one person to feed the key points back to the main group. That could be the same person. Please also just note down which breakout room you're in, as that will make it easier when we come back. And don't worry, we're not going to ask each group to report back everything they discussed, but just one or two key points. Okay, so finally, we're about to move into the rooms. Don't worry if you don't remember all that, because it's all written down in this Google Doc, which I've just shared now, along with the 6 scenarios. So you can all introduce yourselves and then read through the scenarios and pick one. If that link doesn't work, just to click on it, you can just copy and paste it into your browser. Right, so now we have 15 minutes in breakout rooms. If you have any problems when you're in your rooms, you can click the call for help or come back to the main room, and Robert, I think, who's very kindly doing the tech on this call, will help you out. Okay, Robert, if you're there, you can send us to the breakout rooms. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I think some people are still coming back. I hope you had good discussions in your rooms. My group certainly did. So now we're just going to do a very quick feedback session. We don't have time to go around to each group in turn, but if each group's note taker could please post their notes into the chat, then we can all see what people spoke about and we can pick out some key highlights. So you don't have to do it in turn. You can just post your notes in, and if you can preface it by your breakout room number and by the scenario you talked about, so whether it was flooding or wildfire, that would be great. Okay, there's group 3. Great. So while others are posting their notes in, I'm going to have a look. So breakout group 3 spoke about a landslip scenario and what happens if employees can't get into work, can't get into the building. The person who was appointed to feedback, do you want to tell me like what your concern was and how you decided you could deal with that?
I will start, but I will let anyone from my group butt in if you want. So we identified there was kind of 2 things that we were thinking about. Immediately, the kind of communication to staff, and we also highlighted the importance of highlighting to researchers or people who'd be looking to access the archives as well, particularly within a remote location, the expectation that it might take days for people to get to the archives. So the kind of an immediate extreme weather event, or in this case, a landslip, would be quite problematic. So we thought about different ways that we could communicate beyond a phone line. So social media and radio. I'm really excited about using radio as my new communications method. So we kind of thought about that, and then also thinking as a kind of immediate response, but in the future, how we would maybe set up things like phone trees or other forms of communication, things like collecting communication information, like contact information for visiting researchers, so that if you, as soon as you can warn someone that the archive is going to be accessible, you can. And then the second thing that we were kind of looking at was actually the effect of the landslip on the building and on the kind of the archive collection itself. So we talked about everything from calling the emergency services to setting up an alternative location to kind of begin an evacuation process if needed, being able to consult your excellent emergency planning guidance, which you had developed as a result of this new guidance that we're publishing at the moment, and then kind of laterally thinking about what stakeholders need to be engaged in a reopening plan, who else you could kind of consult. So Harwell, which was described to me as the ambulance service for documents, which I'm very excited by. And also then kind of in future planning, also thinking about who is prepared to and able to step in within an emergency. So I was talking about the example of spare keys. Who has your spare keys and can open up if needed, or if you can't get there? But yeah, anyone else from my group want to chip in?
I think you've about covered it, Katrina. Thank you.
It's great you're thinking at that level of detail about spare keys and that sort of thing. Okay, thank you for that. I was in group 2. Jennifer was taking notes. Jennifer, were you able to post them into the chat? I don't.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to post them into the Google Doc. Let me just pop it into the chat.
All right. Sorry, I wasn't clear on that.
No, that's fine. Let's see. So what we looked at was scenario 1 about the flooding in the basement, because we had thought that was quite a likely thing to happen, and then 2 people within our group said yes, that's happened to us. So it was good to have that expertise. So the first one was identify the risks to the building and the organisation. So we kind of went through the list of the types of risks. So there was obviously damage to the building and objects and material within the building, and then the cost of fixing the building itself and drying out the records, but any potential loss of revenue if you were an organisation that that gained revenue by exhibitions or events, then that might not be possible. A really big thing was reputational damage and the impact of the building being closed if a service like Click and Collect had to be suspended, and then the feeling of, we have a responsibility for storing this collection safely, and we're not actually able to do that, and that might lead to a loss of trust from donors and stakeholders. And then sometimes, as was mentioned, the press very occasionally may take things and blow them out of proportion, such as the water ingress in the National Records of Scotland. So there's a whole load of reputational damage issues there.
Jennifer, just to say, do you just want to pull out one more key point, because we'll need to move on to the next group?
Yeah, sure.
The lack of time. Thanks.
When we were talking about what we needed to protect, we reckoned that there was buildings, contents, staff, volunteers, and your access and your infrastructure. So lots of different things to think about, and measures that can be taken. We recognise that we would like them to be high priority, but that wouldn't necessarily be possible.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Okay, and group 3, is it? No, sorry, group 1 with Linda.
That's me. I have pasted the stuff into the chat and failed to find on my new laptop how to send it, but I can just quickly say what we did. We did everything wrongly and informally, and that will be my fault. But we were looking at risks, and we had good discussion about risks. Some of the risks were that it's not necessarily true that if you're in an old site there are more challenges. There are different challenges in new sites, and some old sites work very well. That's like the built heritage, or can do. We talked a bit about standards and the fact that original BS 5454 standards were based on what mechanical engineering could achieve and were over rigorous, and there is now a much more informed set of standards and availability and recommendations, but they can be more difficult to interpret for people. I know that people have some difficulties with that because it does put the responsibility back to the custodian. We talked a bit about passive architecture and passive solutions and how successful that can be. And then we talked a little about the politics and dynamics. In a larger organisation, certainly, you will have an estates department, possibly a facilities management. Perhaps you might also have consultants or contractors all discussing, and then you'll have preservation experts. So the need for specialists to be able to talk to each other and respect each other and have seats at the table. That sounds a lot worse than it actually is, but if you know what I mean, that there needs to be an equal balance here when we're looking at things like that. There is a balance to be had between carbon savings and energy requirement, and actually they're not mutually exclusive, but there needs to be some dialogue. You can't just have one or the other. There needs to be looking at what the impact of applying these in a black and white fashion. If anybody else from my group 1 wants to chime in, I completely lost the plot and was chatting about this to everybody. So it was very interesting chat, and the risks were very, very similar from London and the southeast to north of Scotland and Edinburgh. We were all talking the same language, so there's a lot of commonality.
Great, thanks, Linda. Really interesting. And finally, group 4, we had Fiona and Ellie, I think, was in that group.
Yeah, so we were looking at working for a small local authority in a historic building with vegetation growing in the stonework. The building found to be unstable. The risks we found for the building was 1, collapse of the building, potential falling masonry, an ingress of water, arrest of people within the building, arrest of the materials with a change of the environment, or potential water ingress, and effects on humidity and the climate within the stores. So we sort of looked up pushing, depending on the length of time referred to within the survey, which is mentioned on the immediacy of actions, we've decided to step up building checks, so checking the stores, making sure everything is as it should be, get some more disaster management training for staff. If material is found to be in a dangerous zone within the building, get that removed and stored elsewhere. Also, when speaking to the local authority, if they, it could be a danger that the entire department is shut down permanently as a tool for saving money instead of investing in the building. So we spoke about maybe approaching them more based on risk to people as opposed to records, and also think of other ways to engage people with archives whilst a building is closed, and also to possibly push for grant funding for a new building. That could be a good opportunity. If that can't be done, then arrange for a plan for the vegetation to be removed and for the building to be made sound, and also to include funding in the future to keep up the maintenance of the building itself. I kind of rattled through that really quickly, but if anyone else in breakout room 4 has anything else to add.
Thank you, Fiona. I think that was really good.
Thank you. I hope I got everything in. I just ran through it fast enough.
It'll do.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that last point about sort of long-term funding is crucial, because a lot of measures you need to take to adapt to climate change require quite significant funding, like capital projects to your building, and like long-term strategic planning as well. So it's really important to get directors and board sort of aware of this and engaged and bought into this project. So anyway, I'm just going to very quickly pass back to Victoria and Linda to wrap up this session. I hope you all found that useful. So over to Linda and Victoria. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. I just wanted to say very shortly, there remains an opportunity to feedback, and that's always open at Scottish Council on Archives. We do want to make this a live document. And also a reminder to update your plan annually from SCA if you want to. We'll send emails telling you it's now time to look at your incident control plan and check your numbers and your contacts. But I want to thank everyone who came today and attended and participated, all our speakers, our partners Creative Carbon Scotland and National Records of Scotland, and those who've contributed and who have worked on this publication, but not least the staff of Scottish Council on Archives, who are very patient, especially when I've not sent my chat in. I don't know what I've done with that. Thank you for joining us today, and please do download Planning Matters and look at, I think, will we be offering Victoria some information, and we'll be writing up our information from the feedback seminars here? And
yes, yeah, we'll provide a summary of the notes for everyone, and this will also be recorded afterwards in case anyone wanted to share it or pass it on, and we'll be able to share it with people who weren't able to attend.
Thank you. So thank you to everyone, and it's really been very interesting, I think, and I think it is important. My big thing is that I love the idea that there is a charity called Sniffer, and that the climate change map, horrifying as it is, looks to me like a Paul Smith design where the lines move across all these bands from red to blue. But the most important thing is that it's not all bleak, that we can learn and adapt, that we can do small things, make the right choices, even if it's small choices, even if it's how you dispose of your PPE and your gloves. There's things like that that we can all take a part in, and it will all make a difference. It will all make a difference. We have to all participate. So thank you today to everybody who's been involved.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have good weekends.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.